Princess Valis Saranokai became queen on the worst day of her life. She stood in the medical wing of the royal palace and watched her father take his last breath while alarms screamed throughout the building, and the sky outside burned orange. With falling debris from destroyed ships, the poison had taken 6 days to kill him, and she had held his hand through every terrible hour of it now. He was gone, and she was queen, and the Dominion Warfleet hung in orbit above her world like a death sentence written in metal and fire. 200 capital ships against a planet whose entire defense force had been reduced to scattered wreckage floating in the void. Her mother had died in the first orbital strike 3 weeks ago when a precision beam had torn through the summer palace during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. Her brother, Kellen, had commanded the flagship of their small fleet, and his ship had been the first to fall in the battle that followed. She was 23 years old, and she had just lost everyone she loved in the span of a single month. The advisor standing behind her cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, we must discuss the terms of surrender." Valith did not turn around because she knew that if she looked at him, she would say something she could not take back. "Leave me. Your Majesty, the Dominion has made it clear that any delay will result in orbital bombardment of civilian centers, and we cannot." "I said leave me." The advisor left, and Valith finally allowed herself to sink into the chair beside her father's bed. She had not slept in 4 days, and she had not eaten in 2, and she could feel her body beginning to fail, or even as her mind raced through options that did not exist. The Dominion wanted her world because it sat at the intersection of 3 major hyperspace routes, and whoever controlled Desara Prime controlled trade across an entire sector of the galaxy. Her father had spent 40 years building alliances and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts with dozens of species across the spiral. None of them had come. The Galactic Assembly had issued a statement expressing deep concern and calling for peaceful resolution, which meant precisely nothing. The Velkari Confederacy had recalled their ambassador and closed their borders. The Space Orcs Trade Consortium had frozen all Thessaran accounts and declared neutrality. One by one, every ally her father had cultivated and found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. When the Dominion King, calling Vaith, understood why, even as she hated them for it. The Dominion was the largest military power in the known galaxy, and they had made examples of anyone who opposed them. Entire worlds burned to ash and their populations scattered as refugees across 100 systems. No one wanted to be next. So they looked away, and they issued statements, and they pretended that what was happening to the Sara was somehow different from what had happened to all the others. Velith rose from the chair and walked to the observation window that dominated one wall of the medical wing. The capital city spread out below her, still beautiful despite the scars of recent bombardment. Beyond the atmosphere, she could see the distant lights of the blockade ships, and she knew that somewhere up there Dominion commanders were preparing their ground assault. They would land within the week. They would march through her streets, and they would storm her palace, and they would drag her before the cameras in chains. That was how the Dominion operated. They did not simply conquer, they humiliated. They made examples of leaders who resisted so that other leaders would learn not to try. Valith pressed her palm against the cold glass and wondered if she had the courage to face what was coming. A chime sounded from the door, and she almost ignored it. "Your Majesty," her last remaining guard announced, and she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "There is a human here who wishes to speak with you." Valith almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Humans were the youngest species in the galactic community, having only achieved faster than light travel 3 centuries ago. Their navy was small, and their influence was limited, and they had no reason to involve themselves in the affairs of a dying kingdom. "Send him away. He says he served with Commander Serrano on the Constellation's Edge, and that the commander saved his life at the Battle of Varick Shoals." Valith felt something twist in her chest at the mention of her brother. "He says he is here to repay a debt." She turned from the window and stared at the guard for a long moment. "Send him in." The human who entered was not what she had expected. He was average. In almost every way, with a face that would disappear in any crowd, and a build that suggested nothing remarkable. He wore the simple uniform of a Terran merchant marine officer, though something in the way he moved spoke of training that went beyond. Hauling cargo, his eyes were the only thing about him that stood out. They were the eyes of someone who had seen terrible things and survived them. "Your Majesty," he said, and he bowed in the Visceran fashion, which surprised her. "My name is Marcus. Cole and I served under your brother for 3 years. You knew Kellen. He saved my life when anyone else would have left me to burn in a destroyed cockpit. And he told me that humans were stubborn enough to be worth saving." The human paused, and something like grief flickered across his face. "I am here because I owe him a debt that I can never truly repay, but I intend to try. One human cannot stop the Dominion." "No," Marcus Cole agreed. "But one human can make sure the galaxy sees what the Dominion really is, and one human can buy you time, and time is the only thing that matters, right?" Now, Valeth studied this strange small creature who had crossed the vastness of space to honor a debt to a dead man. "Why?" she asked. "Why do this?" "For a world that is not yours, and a people you do not know." Marcus Cole met her eyes without flinching. "Because your brother believed the galaxy could be better, and because someone has to be the one who stands up first, and because humans have never been very good at walking away when someone needs help." He smiled, and there was something fierce in it. It is something of a species-wide character flaw. For the first time in weeks, Valeth felt something other than despair. She did not know if this human could truly help her, but she knew that he was the first person who had not told her to surrender, and that was enough to make her listen. Marcus Cole laid out his plan on a holographic display in the war room, while Valeth and her remaining officers listened in silence. The plan was insane. It was also the only plan anyone had offered that did not involve surrender. "The Dominion expects you to give up," Cole said, as he gestured at the orbital positions of the enemy fleet. "They have done this dozens of times before, and it always goes the same way because no one ever fights back. Because fighting back is suicide," General Torth said, and the old soldier's voice was heavy with bitterness. "We have 3,000 soldiers remaining against an invasion force of 50,000, and our orbital defenses are destroyed, and our fleet is gone." "You are thinking like a soldier," Cole replied, "and that is exactly what the Dominion wants, because in a straight military confrontation, you lose every time." "Then what do you suggest?" Valeth asked Cole, turned to face her, and there was something almost hungry in his expression. "I suggest we stop fighting their war and start fighting ours." He pulled up a map of the capital city and began highlighting streets and buildings and underground passages. "Humans have been fighting against superior forces for our entire history, and we have learned some things along the way. The Dominion has technology that makes your weapons look like toys," Torath said. "No offense intended." "None taken, and you are correct," Cole agreed. "But technology does not win wars by itself, and the Dominion has a weakness that they do not even realize they have, which is they need to win cleanly," Cole said. "They need the surrender and the parade and the public humiliation because that is how they control the narrative, and that is how they keep other worlds afraid." He zoomed in on the palace complex. "If we make them fight for every block and every building and every corridor, then they cannot have their clean victory. And if we broadcast everything we do, then suddenly the whole galaxy is watching the Sara." Valeth began to understand what he was suggesting. "You want to turn our defeat into a symbol. I want to turn your resistance into something the Dominion cannot kill." Cole said, "Empires are built on fear, and the moment people stop being afraid, the empire starts to crumble. And if we all die in the process." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Then you die standing up," and every species in the galaxy sees that it is possible to stand up, and maybe that is enough to make someone else try. The room was silent as the weight of his words settled over them. General Toroth shook his head slowly. This is madness. Yes, Cole agreed, but it is the only kind of madness that has any chance of working. Vaelith looked at the holographic map and thought about her father and her mother and her brother. She thought about the allies who had abandoned them and the empire that wanted to make an example of her. And she made a decision. Tell me what you need. Cole smiled, and for the next 6 hours, he transformed the war room into something that resembled a human military academy. He taught them about guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics and the power of controlling information. Showed them footage from human history of small groups holding off massive armies through cleverness and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He explained how to turn the winding streets of the capital into a maze of choke points and ambush sites. He demonstrated how to create improvised weapons from everyday materials. But more than anything else, he taught them about morale. People do not die for governments, he said, as the night grew late and exhaustion hung heavy in the room. They do not die for abstract concepts like sovereignty or national pride. What do they die for then? Vaelith asked. They die for each other. Cole said, they die for the person standing next to them and the family waiting at home and the leader who makes them believe that their sacrifice means something. He looked directly at Vaelith. Your people need to know you, and they need to believe that you are willing to die beside them, and they need to see that you care about them as people, not just as subjects. How do I do that? You walk among them, Cole said. You learn their names, and you hear their stories, and you share their suffering, and you let them see that you are not hiding in your palace while they bleed in your streets. Vaelith thought about the refugee camps that had sprung up across the city, filled with people who had lost everything to the Dominion bombardment. She had not visited them. She had been too busy with military briefings and diplomatic communications and the 1,000 other tasks that consumed a queen's time during a crisis. She realized now that she had been hiding, not in the way Cole meant, but hiding nonetheless, hiding from the faces of the people she had failed to protect. There is something else, Cole said. Something humans learned a long time ago. What is that? Names have power, he said. Every soldier who dies defending this city should have their name spoken aloud so that everyone knows who they were and what they gave. Why? Because when people hear the names, they remember that these are real people fighting and dying, and that makes it harder for the galaxy to look away. He paused, and something haunted flickered in his eyes. And because the dead deserve to be remembered, Vaelith stood and walked to the window where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. Somewhere above that sky, the Dominion fleet was preparing to destroy everything she loved. We begin today, she said. Take me to the refugee camps. Cole nodded, and something like hope crossed his weathered face. Your Majesty, if I may say something, speak freely. Your brother told me once that the galaxy was broken, and that someone needed to start fixing it. Cole said, I think he would be proud of what you are about to do. Vaelith felt tears prick at her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Then let us make sure his faith was not misplaced. She turned from the window and walked toward the door behind her. Marcus Cole followed, and together they went to meet the people they were asking to fight and die the war, for the sorrow was about to begin, and for the first time the Dominion would face something they had never encountered before, a world that refused to break. The Dominion ground forces landed on the 7th day, expecting a coronation of their own making. Their commanders had done this before on a dozen other worlds, and it always went the same way. The local government would surrender, and the Queen would be paraded in chains before the cameras, and another world would be added to the Dominion's ever-growing territory. What they found instead was a city that had learned to bite. The first assault wave pushed into the outer districts with confidence. Born of overwhelming firepower, they had tanks and artillery and air support, and soldiers in powered armor that could shrug off small arms fire. They had 50,000 troops against a defending force that numbered less than 5,000. They should have rolled through the city in a matter of hours. Instead, they lost 300 soldiers, taking a single district Cole had spent the previous 6 days transforming the capital into a death trap. Every street had become a potential ambush site with it. Defenders appearing from hidden positions, firing a few shots and then vanishing into underground tunnels before the Dominion could respond. Every building had been prepared with traps and choke points and escape routes that allowed small groups to hold off much larger forces. The winding architecture of the Thessaran capital, which had always been a source of civic pride, became a weapon in its own, right as Dominion columns found themselves channeled into killing grounds where their numerical advantage meant nothing. But Cole's true genius was not in the tactics, it was in the camera. Small drones followed every engagement, capturing footage of the fighting and transmitting it through a network of hidden relays that somehow kept reaching the broader galaxy. Despite Dominion jamming, the galaxy saw Dominion soldiers firing on civilian areas, and they saw the bodies of children pulled from rubble, and they saw the true face of the Empire that claimed to bring peace and order to them. Stars. They also saw Queen Velishi appeared in the footage directing defenders from a shattered balcony with her crown replaced by a soldier's helmet and her royal robes traded for practical armor. She was there when the barricades were built, and she was there when they fell, and she was there to drag wounded soldiers to safety when the fighting became too intense. Cole had told her that people needed to see her, and she had taken his words to heart in ways that surprised even him. She learned the name of every defender who died, and each night she broadcast those names across whatever channels they could reach. The broadcasts always ended the same way: "These are the people of Thessara, and they will not surrender, and neither will I." The second assault wave lost 500 soldiers, and the Dominion commanders began requesting orbital bombardment. The requests were denied. The Dominion needed Thessara intact because a ruined world was useless for controlling trade routes, and because they needed the surrender and the parade and the message. They needed to show the galaxy that resistance was futile instead. The galaxy was seeing something very different on the third day of the ground assault. Protests erupted on Velkari Prime. The footage from Thessara had spread across their networks, and people who had been content to look away were suddenly confronting the reality of what the Dominion was doing. The Velkari government issued a statement calling for immediate cessation of hostilities, which was still meaningless, but it was more than they had said before in the Orcs Trade Consortium. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about the cost of doing business with an empire that slaughtered civilians, and in the halls of the Galactic Assembly, representatives who had voted for neutrality found their constituents demanding to know why they had abandoned Thessara. Cole watched the reports coming in and allowed himself a small smile. "It is working," Valith said, and there was wonder in her voice. "They are actually paying attention." "Fear is a powerful thing," Cole replied. "But so is shame, and right now the galaxy is feeling ashamed of itself." "Will that be enough?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "I do not." "No," he admitted, "but it is more than we had a week ago." The fourth day brought the heaviest fighting yet, as the Dominion pushed toward the Palace District with renewed fury. They had realized what was happening, and they were desperate to end the siege before public opinion turned any further against them. Cole led a counterattack that recaptured a key intersection and held it for 6 hours. Against repeated assaults, Valith fought beside him using a weapon that Cole had taught her to fire. And she discovered that she was not afraid, or rather she was afraid, but she had learned that fear did not have to stop her from acting when the position finally became untenable. She was the last to leave, helping a wounded soldier down into the tunnels, while Dominion fire tore the air above her head. "You should not take such risks," Cole told her later as medics treated cuts on her arms. You are too valuable to lose. You take risks every day. I am one human, Cole said. You are the reason. This entire planet is fighting. Velith shook her head. They are not fighting for me, and they are fighting because you showed them that fighting was possible. They are fighting because you gave them something to believe in, Cole replied. I just taught them how not to die quite as quickly. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. A small ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Broadcasting a humanitarian aid coded was a human vessel crewed entirely by volunteers who had seen the broadcast from the Sara and decided they could not stand by and do nothing. They brought medical supplies and food and ammunition, and something even more valuable. They brought hope. There are more coming, the ship's captain told. Velith freighters and passenger vessels, and even a few armed escorts, and they are coming from everywhere. Why, Velith asked the captain, was a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and she smiled at the question. Because humans cannot watch someone fight alone and not want to help, she said. It is built into us somehow, and we see you standing up against an empire and something inside. Yua says that we have to stand with you. Cole stood in the background and said nothing, but Velith saw something glisten in his eyes. The aid convoy was small, and it would not change the military balance, but it was proof that the galaxy was watching, and some of them were finally starting to care. That night, Velith made her broadcast as usual, reading the names of the fallen and speaking directly to whoever might be listening. But this time, she added something new to the ships that came to help us today. I want you to know that your courage gives us strength, and to everyone else who is watching, I ask only this. She paused and looked directly into the camera. How many more names do you need to hear before you decide to act? The broadcast ended, and Velith sat in the ruins of her throne room, feeling exhaustion deep in her bones. Outside, the fighting continued as it would continue until they won or they died. But somewhere out in the darkness, help was coming. She could only pray it would come in time. On the 12th day of the siege, the Dominion breached the palace walls. Velith had known this moment would come, and she had prepared for it as best she could. She had sent away everyone she could spare, including the wounded and the exhausted, and anyone who had family waiting somewhere beyond the Dominion blockade. What remained was a handful of guards, too, loyal to leave, and a few dozen volunteers, too, stubborn to accept defeat, and one human who had become the heart of everything they had. Built Marcus Cole stood beside her in the throne room as the sounds of fighting echoed through the corridors. His face was pale from blood loss, and exhaustion had carved deep lines around his eyes. But he still held his weapon steady, and he still refused to leave. You should go, Val said. You have done more than anyone could ask, and more than anyone had any right to expect. Cole checked his weapon and smiled despite everything. Your Majesty, with respect, I did not cross the galaxy to do enough, and I came here to finish this one way or another. We are going to die. Probably, Cole agreed. But we are going to die standing up, and the whole galaxy is going to see it. And that means something, does it? Your brother thought so, Cole said quietly. He saved me because he believed that one person choosing to do the right thing could change everything, and I have spent every day since trying to prove him right. Velith felt tears burning in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not now. Not when her people needed to see her strong. The Dominion will not remember us kindly, she said. History is not written by the winners, Cole replied. It is written by whoever tells the best story, and our story is going to echo for a long time. An explosion shook the building, and plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. The fighting was getting closer. Cole turned to face the main doors and raised his weapon. When they come through, focus on the officers and the heavy weapons, and let me handle the door for as long as I can. Marcus, he looked back at her. Thank you, Velith said, for everything. Save your thanks for when we survive this, Cole said. and his smile was the bravest thing she had ever seen. "And if we do not survive, then thank me in whatever comes next." The doors exploded inward, and the Dominion poured through Cole, fired and kept firing, even as enemy rounds tore into the barricade around him. He was not a superhuman, and he was not a legendary warrior. And he was just one man with a gun and a debt he was determined to repay. But one man in the right place can change everything. Held the door for nearly 3 minutes, which does not sound like much, but in combat, 3 minutes is an eternity for. Dominion soldiers went down before they finally brought him down, and even then he kept fighting, trying to reload his weapon with hands that would no longer obey him. Valeth screamed his name, but there was no time for grief. The enemy was already advancing, and she was the last thing standing between them and victory. She raised her blade and faced the Dominion commander, who walked toward her through the smoke and ruin. He was tall even for his species, with cold eyes and the confident posture of someone who had never known defeat. "It is over, little queen," he said, and his voice dripped with contempt. "You have made your point, and I admit you have been more troublesome than expected, but this ends now." "Then end it," Valeth said. The commander laughed, still defiant, and "I almost admire it, but defiance will not save you, and nothing will save you, because you are alone. I was alone before," Valeth said, "and I'm still standing. Not for long." He raised his weapon, and Valeth prepared to die. She thought about her father, who had taught her that a ruler's duty was to protect their people. She thought about her mother, who had shown her that kindness was its own kind of strength. She thought about her brother, who had believed the galaxy could be better, and she thought about Marcus Cole, who had crossed the stars to prove that one person's choice could matter. She would not kneel, she would not beg, she would die as a queen, and she would die as herself, and the Dominion would know that they had never truly broken her. The commander's finger tightened on the trigger, and then the sky screamed. The sound was like nothing Valeth had ever heard before. It was the roar of engines and the thunder of weapons and the shriek of atmosphere tearing open as ships dropped out of hyperspace directly above the capital. The commander froze and pressed his hand to his earpiece, and his expression changed from triumph to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. "What is happening?" Valeth demanded. The commander did not answer. More explosions shook the building, but these were different. These were coming from above, through the shattered windows of the throne room. Valeth could see lights in the sky. Hundreds of lights. Ships were falling toward the planet like stars being born, and they were firing at the Dominion fleet in orbit. "Impossible," the commander whispered, but it was not impossible. It was happening. Valeth looked at the chaos unfolding above her and felt something. She had almost forgotten how to feel hope. She looked at the Dominion commander and saw uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. "It seems," she said, "that I am not as alone as you thought." The commander's weapon wavered, and in that moment of hesitation, Valeth moved. She was not a warrior, and she was not trained for combat, but she had spent 12 days fighting for her life, and she had learned a few things. Her blade found its mark, and the Dominion commander fell around her. The remaining Dominion a commander fell around her, fell around her, fell around her. The remaining Dominion soldiers were retreating as reports flooded in about the battle unfolding in orbit. Valeth did not pursue them. Instead, she ran to where Marcus Cole lay amid the wreckage of the barricade. He was still breathing, barely. "Marcus," she said, and now the tears did fall. "Marcus, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, and he looked past her at the lights filling the sky. "Told you," he whispered. "Someone always comes." "You need to hold on," Valeth said. "Help is here, and you need to hold on." Cole smiled. And it was the same brave smile he had worn since the day he arrived. "Did we win?" "We did," Valeth said. "We won." "Good," Cole breathed. "That is good." His eyes closed, and for a terrible moment, Valeth thought he was gone, but his chest still rose and fell, and his heart still beat. The war was not over, but for the first time, Valith believed they might actually survive it outside. The palace ships from a dozen worlds were engaging the Dominion fleet, and the sky burned with the light of a battle that would reshape the galaxy, all because one human had refused to let a debt go unpaid, all because one queen had refused to surrender, and all because somewhere in the vastness of space, people had finally decided to stop looking away. The Terran Third Fleet had arrived first with 47 ships, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation directly between the Dominion blockade and the planet below it. It was a fraction of the Dominion's strength, but it was not meant to win. Alone behind the Terran ships came the Valkyrie, with their sleek cruisers and their bitter memories of Dominion expansion pushing against their own borders. Behind them came the Orcs, with their massive cargo haulers converted into makeshift carriers, because even merchants have limits to what they will tolerate. And behind them came ships from a dozen other species, who had watched the broadcast from the Sahara and decided that enough was finally enough. The combined fleet still did not match the Dominion in raw numbers, but they did not have to win. They only had to make winning too expensive. The battle in orbit raged for 6 hours, while on the surface, Dominion ground commanders suddenly found their supply lines cut and their reinforcements blocked, and their certain victory crumbling around them. When the final tally came in, the Dominion had lost 37 capital ships and nearly 8,000 soldiers. They could have pressed the attack and probably still won, but the cost had become impossible. Other worlds were watching, and other worlds were asking themselves if they might be next, and the Dominion's grip on the Galactic Order depended on making resistance seem futile. Thessera had proven that resistance was possible, and that changed everything. The withdrawal order came on the morning of the 14th day, and Valith watched from the steps of her shattered palace as Dominion shuttles lifted off and Dominion soldiers marched in orderly columns toward their extraction points. They were not beaten. They were choosing to leave, but the difference between defeat and withdrawal did not matter to the people of Thessera. What mattered was that they were free. Valith spent the next 3 days in a blur of activity, meeting with commanders from the Allied fleet and coordinating relief efforts, and began the long process of rebuilding a world that had nearly been destroyed. But on the 4th day, she made time for something more important: the medical bay of the Terran flagship was quiet and clean, and filled with the soft hum of life support systems and healing technology. Marcus Cole lay in a bed surrounded by enough bandages to mummify a lesser species. His eyes were closed when Valith entered, but they opened at the sound of her footsteps. "Your Majesty," he said, and his voice was weak but steady. "You should not be here, and you have more important things to do." "There is nothing more important than this," Valith said. She sat in the chair beside his bed and took his hand in hers. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable for a ballet photos Thesseran queen 2 weeks ago, but the woman she had become no longer cared about such things. "The Galactic Assembly has formally condemned the Dominion attack," she said, "and 12 species have signed what they are calling the Thessera Accords, a mutual defense pact. Yes, and there are more considering joining every day." Cole smiled, and it was the same smile that had given her courage in the darkest moments of the siege. "That is good news." "It is your news," Valith said. "You made this happen." "I held a door," Cole said. "You are the one who gave them something to believe in." "We both held that door." Cole was quiet for a moment, and Valith could see memories moving behind his eyes. "Your brother would be proud of you," he said finally. "He always talked about you, and he always believed you would be a great queen someday." Valith felt tears threatening again, but this time they were not tears of grief. "When you are healed," she said, "I am going to need an advisor. Your Majesty, I am just a cargo hauler. You are the man who taught a world how to fight." Valith said, And you are the man who showed the galaxy that standing up is possible, and I think we are going to need more of that before this is over. The Dominion will not forget what happened here. No, they will not. And that is exactly why I need someone who understands how to turn stubbornness into strategy. Cole laughed and then winced. As the movement pulled at his wounds, humans are good at stubborn, he admitted. It is about the only thing we are really good at. That is not true. Valeth said, you are also good at hope. She squeezed his hand gently. You came here alone with nothing but a debt and a belief that things could be better, and you changed the course of galactic history. I just did what felt right, and that is exactly what I need. Valeth said, someone who does what feels right, even when everyone else says it is. Impossible. Cole looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. But she already knew what his answer would be, because she had learned something about humans in the past 2 weeks. They were not the strongest species, and they were not the smartest, and they were not the most advanced. But they had something that no other species seemed to possess in quite the same way. They had the absolute stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible, and that made them dangerous not to the people they protected, but to anyone who tried to tell them that standing up was not worth the cost. All right, Cole said finally, but I am going to need a better title than advisor. What did you have in mind? I do not know, Cole admitted, but something that sounds impressive and maybe intimidates. Dominion diplomats. Valeth smiled, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, it felt natural. We will figure something out. Outside the viewport, ships from a dozen worlds hung in orbit like stars being born. The Dominion was still out there, and the real fight was only beginning. But for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy was not facing it alone, and it had started with one human who refused to walk away, one human who believed that a debt of honor was worth more than his own life, one human who had looked at an impossible situation and decided to try anyway. That was the thing about humans. Valeth realized they did not know when to quit, and sometimes that made all the difference. The war for the future of the galaxy would be long and difficult, and there would be many more sacrifices before it was done, but the sorrow would be there, and so would the strange, stubborn species that had taught them how to hope. Together they would face whatever came next, and together they would remind the galaxy that empires fall when people stop being afraid. The broadcasts from the Sara continued to spread across the stars, carrying the story of a princess queen who refused to kneel and a human who refused to leave her side. And somewhere in the darkness of space, other worlds began to wonder if maybe they too could find the courage to stand. The Dominion had wanted to make an example of Desserati had succeeded, just not in the way they intended, and